I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Sky Nelson Isaacs, a physics educator, speaker, author, and musician. He has a master's degree in physics from San Francisco State University with a thesis in string theory and a BS in physics from UC Berkeley. Sky has dedicated his life to finding his own sense of purpose, beginning as the student of the yogic master Sri Swami Satchidananda when he was less than 5 years old. His writing on topics like flow comes from integrating this experience into his life. He brings together the connection between synchronicity, physics, and real life using research and original ideas. As an active researcher in quantum foundations, his research is supported through grant funding from private foundations. He's an educator with 9 years of classroom experience, with experience in industry as a software engineer, and also as a multi-instrumentalist and professional performer of award-winning original music compositions. So Sky, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Tim.
I'm so excited to have you here. I'm so excited to talk about synchronicity. Let me start out by asking, how can you describe this, I guess, for the audience? And what are we experiencing when it happens?
Well, I like to remind people that synchronicity is not just a meaningful coincidence that is positive. Like a serendipity is often thought of, like The Three Princes of Serendip is a novel from the 1800s where these people go on an exploration and they run into unexpected people at unexpected times, and it's like guiding their trip. And it's really seen as beneficial. I like to pull away from the sort of view of synchronicity as it's like rare and beneficial moments of connection and coincidence, and think about it like it's a model for how meaningful experiences happen.
Okay.
So synchronicities are actually also the sources of many problems in our lives. Like if you've ever had something happen that's exactly the wrong thing to say, you say something, you say happy birthday to somebody, and like, actually, my birthday was, a long time ago or whatever, you say the wrong thing at the wrong time, and it's like coincidental. And but what it can do is open up a portal for you to actually have a deeper experience. So you make a faux pas at a party or something like that, and it actually opens up the opportunity to be more authentic, to show your vulnerable side. Or so I like to think of synchronicities as opportunities for growth and guidance for growth. Like if we get, I've had things happen at work, and people talk to me about their experiences at work where they become upset about something that happens, and that can be seen as a synchronicity. It can be seen as a trigger for an experience that we are actually learning from. So as an example of synchronicity is, I have a friend who had a stone on her ring that she wanted to identify. She couldn't remember what it was, and just casually was interested in remembering. So she wrote to her jeweler and didn't hear back. But that same day, she went to the salon to get her nails done. And as she was leaving the salon, the manicurist asked her if she had a stamp card, to get credit. And so she reached in her purse to find her stamp card, pulls it out. She pulls out the wrong card. She pulls out the business card for the jeweler. And on the back of it are the words blue topaz. So she finds out what the name of her stone is from some information she had long ago, without getting it from the actual person that she thought she was going to get it from. So there's this flow of circumstances where she reaches out for help from one person, ends up in a different situation that's unexpected with another person, is told to do something, reach in her purse, and pulls out the very information she's looking for. So how does nature orchestrate that dance of meaning and information? How do we get the information we need at the right time? That's what I would call synchronicity. And synchronicity is not like an outcome necessarily. It's an opportunity or a potential. It's like a reminder of what could be next if you take the opportunity in front of you.
Yeah. Well, so a couple of what I think may be examples also. I want to drop these out there. One of them, this is true. My mother, many years ago, had an incredible pain in her hand, right? And she had this thought that maybe it involved my grandmother. I have no idea why. So she called her, hundreds, thousands of miles away. They were living in different states at the time. My grandmother had just burned her hand very, very, very badly cooking, right? And so they shared the same pain without even knowing it, miles away. So would that qualify as a synchronicity, do you think?
Well, some people would try and describe that as like, what would that be? Psychokinesis or telepathy. And I think of all these experiences in light of the same phenomenon of synchronicity. I'm not an expert on these other phenomenon that we call psychic, so I don't really say much about those. But what I might say is that when that happens, there is a way of describing that situation from a physical perspective. And that's what I try and explain with the physics of synchronicity, saying that there's some correlation between the timing of something actually going on in your friend's body, like her hand, that is unrelated to her mom, but is related to something in her, in her experience, in her health. But it's the timing of that with her mom's experience that is synchronistic. And so what we can study there, if we want to look at that through that lens of synchronicity, we can look at how do these events happen at the similar time, and is there some meaningful relationship that unfolds from that? And the way I look at that is not that there's a physical medium or like communication of signals going back and forth. That would be, like electromagnetic waves or something like that. I don't believe that's the case. I look at it in the following way. You have a tree of possible outcomes, like a decision tree. And that can be described with quantum information science, the branching of a multiverse of a wave function. And there's some obstacles to that, and it's controversial. But if you can do that, then you start to see over time, you got the bottom of the tree, which is a single branch, and then the top of the tree, which has many branches. And if the top of the tree has certain outcomes that are meaningful, I call those like the apples on the tree. If it has certain outcomes that are meaningful, are we able to connect to or highlight or amplify those particular outcomes? It's not so that they definitely happen, but so we increase the likelihood that they happen. And the way that the apple can happen, the way that, like, let's say the outcome of your friend hurting her hand and realizing it's connected to her mom is that they form a tighter relationship. They have some bond over it. If she's seeking to have a deeper bond with her mom, she doesn't even realize it, but this is a way to get to that apple.
Yeah.
So the synchronicity is a thing that happens that you don't see the context right away, but it's getting you to an experience that you're actually going to grow from.
Well, so let me give one more example. This isn't from my own family. This is one that I've read about. This might be a little bit closer, though. Hypothetically speaking, there's kind of a two case here. Let's say you're thinking about your mother. You talked to her earlier in the day. You bump into her at the local grocery store. That's not necessarily synchronicity because you probably think about her fairly often, right? It's just coincidence. Right. Synchronicity might be, and this is, I've read about this. You're thinking about a long lost love from college. Haven't seen them, haven't thought about them in 20 years. For some reason, they pop into your mind. You run into them at the grocery store, right? Very similar situation. But I mean, statistically speaking, one of these is darn near impossible to happen, right? That second one, running into someone, it doesn't have to be a lover. I mean, I've read variations on this story many times. People will say, you know what? I hadn't even thought about this person in years. And I was just thinking about them that day. And there they were, right? Would that be synchronicity, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I tell an example in my first book, Living in Flow, but one of the biggest synchronicities I ever had, where I was traveling in Europe, and my good friend, who I had dated a little bit, Dana, was traveling in Israel. We made this really vague plan to meet in Greece because it was like a chance for us to connect while we were have some fun while traveling. But I got sick and I had to head home, and my plane was out of Paris. So I never told her. I just was going to go home and call her from home. But she was waiting for me and got invited to go to Paris herself by her friends. And she almost said no because she was waiting for me to call. She would have missed my call. But she said, forget Sky, I'm going to go to Paris. She goes to Paris, and we both meet by accident at the Louvre Museum. So, I can track all the decisions that went into that connection, and look at the synchronicities along the way of how we chose to be in certain places. And it's phenomenal. What I think is important, a lot of people will dismiss it by saying, if it can happen, it will happen in an infinite universe, right? So there is a chance that it'll happen. So Just got to calculate that chance. I have calculated that chance, and it's a better explanation to come up with some guiding principle for synchronicity than to just ascribe it to randomness.
Well,
chances are just too low in some cases.
I mean, I think, again, anecdotally, I mean, that's what I've read, right? Coincidence is one thing, but this is just ridiculous. And for me, that's the synchronicity line. I've had moments like that myself. But also from stories that I've read, that's kind of what people think. They're like, okay, you know, coincidence is one thing, but come on, something's going on here, you know?
Yeah, and I think what we can do is track it back. You know, you say you thought about your friend for the first time in years, and then you run into them later. Well, what made you think about your friend? Maybe you can track, like, was it a dream, or was it something on the news you saw that reminded you of an experience you had with them long ago? You know, there's a lot of stuff going on in our lives, and that's might be what's reminding you of this person that you end up meeting later. So if you see this as a tree of all the possible ways that events can happen, what you're looking at is correlations between the branches of the tree.
Okay.
Like, you're going to have an experience up here, or you might have an experience up here where you meet them. And then you have an experience down here where you go to the grocery store and you see someone that looks like them and reminds you of them. And that helps you connect the dots. But it's not necessarily a signal, or you're not reading into the future or transmitting psychic waves necessarily. That's not the way I see it. It's this correlation between the possible branches of what we call a multiverse.
Okay. Well,
loosely.
since we're getting into the physics, let me go there with things. From 1946 to 1954, physicist Wolfgang Pauli collaborated with psychologist Carl Jung on the Pauli-Jung conjecture, which tried to correlate synchronicity with elements of quantum theory, such as complementarity, nonlocality, and the observer effect. And so for the audience, if they're not familiar, Wolfgang Pauli was a heavyweight in physics, right? I mean, one of the truly outstanding figures in quantum mechanics. Carl Jung is one of the fathers of modern psychology. And so these are two of the most outstanding figures, I guess, in their own specializations, working together on this. And they both took this very seriously. And it sounds like they were trying to connect this back to quantum events. Do you think there's a connection there?
Well, I think my connection is, I don't know if different or more evolved since that time from what they started with. You know, they're looking at some vague connections between correlations between events that seem disconnected or acausal, and the sort of acausality of quantum mechanics, the uncertainty principle, and how things can be entangled and over a distance. And as you said, complementarity. Complementarity is the trade-off between two exclusive truths. So you've got the particle on one hand, of an electron as a particle. On the other hand, in certain types of experiments, it can show up as a wave. Doesn't mean it's not a particle. It means at that moment you're measuring it in a certain way that gives it these properties. There's a complementarity between these two descriptions. Both descriptions can be true, but you can't have both descriptions at the same time.
Okay.
Now, I think there's a similar complementarity between what we call reductionism, where everything can be broken up into parts and understood that way. Chemistry is this great success in reductionism, right? Because you can break down everything in the material world into atoms. And all these little pieces, if you understand the behavior of those pieces, they tell you the behavior of the big things. So reductionism is everything can be broken down into pieces and understood fully. Holism is this notion that there are some aspects of systems, like systems theory describes this, that cannot be reduced to smaller pieces. And, you know, if you take a person apart, you no longer have a person. They're no longer a living, breathing person. And the physics I use to develop this perspective is the Fourier transform, which is a very, very important, very beautiful, very commonly used mathematical procedure to convert between a physical description, like a shape, and a wave description, like what kinds of waves do you need to put together to get that shape. It's kind of like Legos. You put these pieces together and you get a bigger shape. But there's a holistic relationship where, in order to get one local finite shape like an electron, you have to add up a whole range of non-local, in some sense, frequencies. And this gives this notion of holism, which cannot be reduced to any one part.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the wave, and I'm taking my questions out of sequence here, but uh,
I think I'm leading you there.
yeah, with quantum mechanics, they study a lot of these quantum mechanical principles on a mathematical basis were derived so that you could basically study groups of particles, right? I mean, one of the ideas there was what these individual atoms or particles are doing is too complex for us to measure. In some cases, it's not like with the observer effect, things like that. We're just not able to measure it precisely. So what we're going to do is we're going to work with groups of these, right? Now you end up with wave functions and things like that. As I was doing research on synchronicity, it brought it back to some of the mathematical modeling for itself. And it said that some of these, what are considered observer effects, entanglement effects, are actually kind of mathematical artifacts that show up in wave functions all the time. So maybe that brings this back to what you're saying about this tree of branching possibilities, right? Do you think that this could be just patterns within patterns, I guess?
I like that way of putting it, patterns within patterns. Let me touch on the idea of the wave function in a collective versus individual. A big question, it's not that not that individual particles are too complex. It's that we have a description in quantum mechanics which works, it gives us the right experimental results, but doesn't really specify what the interpretive meaning is. And the easiest way to have a materialist sort of reductionist perspective is to say it doesn't apply, the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics doesn't apply to individual particles. It applies to collections, and out of those collections, individual particles will have a certain statistic likelihood of this or that. That's called an ensemble.
Okay.
But we know now through experiment, like there's this great experiment that was done by Mitsubishi or something like that, shining electrons through a slit, double slit, just like we did with light, shining light through a double slit and getting interference. They shine electrons through a double slit and they slow it down so it's like one at a time. You see these particles appearing on the screen in little spots and it looks random. But overall, throughout the collection of all those particles, each one is behaving independently, it seems. But when you see the whole picture, there's a wave pattern in terms of the distribution of the electrons on the screen. So as a collective, one at a time, they're behaving as a collective. And there's a relationship between all of the electrons, even though they come totally separately.
Do you think that same thing could be the case with synchronicity?
So I've got some new thoughts on synchronicity, actually, that I haven't shared. And this is not developed fully at all. But for those folks who were interested in the Nobel Prize last year, it was on entanglement. And I love these researchers, but I'm not calling them to name to mind at the moment. But who did great experiments in the 80s and 90s and 2000s showing that entanglement is a real thing. And what entanglement says is that if you have two particles which have a common source, so they're described by a single wave function, they really need to be seen as one entity. And that's similar to the notion of holism I was describing earlier. You can't look at one particle and reduce it to itself. It has to be taken into consideration with the other particle. They're actually one wave function together. And so it then, you still look at from that, when you make a measurement on one, you constrain the results of the measurement on the other, even if they're like far apart and you could never affect them, because they're actually one entity across space and time. Space and time, in some sense, are irrelevant in that situation when you're dealing with holism. It's the way I look at it. So one of the things I noticed with synchronicity is actually really similar to what comes out of those experiments. And there's a great paper by N. David Merman, a physicist, who illuminates this in a non-technical way. When you do a entanglement experiment, you shoot a bunch of an ensemble of particles, right? One after the other, it would be 1,000 or 1,000,000 of them. And you look at the statistics. And generally speaking, the statistics are things like, is it pointing up or pointing down when you measure its spin? And so your data is basically up, down, 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 up, down, down, just, it actually seems random because it's coming from a random source. And then the other thing you do is you measure the other particle in a different direction. So it kind of overlaps, but not fully. You got these two different directions that aren't fully overlapped. And you get also an array of up, down, 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 up, down, a different array. Each of those data sets looks random. In the same way that when you have a synchronicity in your life, I might not see it. Your life looks random to me because from my frame, there's not the same context or meaningfulness to the experiences that you're having. So from one perspective, it looks random. But when you compare these two data sets in certain cases, in the cases where their measurement direction aligns, you find full correlation. One particle is measured up, the other particle is always measured up. The other particles measured down, the other one's always measured down. Because you're measuring them in the same direction in those cases, you get full correlation. So in the same sense, when I wonder, and this is total speculation, but it is a similar behavior, that there are, from a certain perspective with a certain context, for you, a synchronicity looks very meaningful. And that meaning is not false, but it is contextual. It's based on your perspective.
Yeah. Well, and that is an interesting, that's a really interesting point, right? Because the meaning behind it is what makes it important, and that's so incredibly subjective, right? And in terms of scientific measurement, I'm sure that makes things really difficult to measure as well, you know?
Well, I think it's actually objective, but not in the way that we think about usually. So that's a great point, because we don't want synchronicity to be based on feelings of like, I like that experience or I don't like that experience. Because, you know, you could go to a movie and say it was synchronistic until you don't like the movie, and then you're like, it wasn't a synchronicity anymore.
Well, I was thinking of, again, people people will say something like, this means something. Somebody else will look at it and say, nah, it's just coincidence, right? Because the meaning is only there for one person. But maybe that's because it's entanglement. Maybe the entanglement's only there for that one person.
Well, let's not delve too much into that parallel, because entanglement has certain properties that, we think we could illuminate. But what I think we can do is define objective meaning. So the subjective meaning, how I feel in any given moment, my interpretation of how I feel in that moment, like, is it good or is it bad? Is it because I'm not doing enough work, or is it because I'm not exercising enough, or is it because I'm really showing up for people in my life? Like, these are all the reasons I form for why I'm doing well or not. But objective meaning has to do with what your actions lead to. So if I interrupt my daughter because she's talking at the table, and I do it from a place of like annoyance because I don't want her to hog the conversation, that's really different from the same action with a different intention. It might come out differently in the interaction, and the result is a different type of possible synchronicity. So I think there's a relationship between what we do in the world and the objective meaning of it. Does it lead to more connection? Does it lead to the things that we want in our lives? Does it lead to getting my point across to somebody? Or does it create a barrier to communication because there's some hidden emotion or agenda that I have?
Well,
so just to say a little bit more about that, if I don't exercise, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be a meaningful step towards loving myself more in the moment in a different way.
Yeah, let me ask about flow, because I know that this is something that you are into, right? And I believe you've written about living in the flow, and this is related to synchronicity, and also you've mentioned a few times, how can I apply this, right? Not just like not just that it happened, but how can I take meaning from this and put that into action to improve my life? Do you think you could speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So understanding the objective nature of the choices that we make, I think, is really helpful. Like, because we do get caught up to, that example of exercise, sort of a given that you're supposed to exercise enough to stay healthy, or to be a good person, or whatever it is, to lose weight, whatever it might be, stay fit. And yet there are times when exercising is an act of self-criticism. I got to do it. I'm going to do it because I have to, because I have a negative self-belief about myself. And so I'm actually doing some harm to myself by engaging in that activity. So objectively, what might be happening is very different from what you think is happening. And tuning in a little bit more to the inner state that you're in, what it is that's driving your motivation to do something, for me, really helps understand what's the objective outcome that I'm going to get from this. I mean, I've grown up. I injured my knees in high school, and the way I injured my knees was because I was on the soccer team, and I was committed to being as fit as possible. So I did this exercise where I stood against the wall. I sat like in a fake chair, just against the wall, strengthening my quads. And I did it for, I kept extending the time that I could do that. And I was, a pretty limber kid, so I could really push myself. And one day I just couldn't even walk on the soccer field because my mind was trying to do something that my body couldn't do, and had a certain intention, which had a certain objective meaning, which was, I'm going to disrespect my own capacity for capabilities and hurt myself because I'm not. Maybe there's something there about like not being good enough as I am, or I don't know. But that's the objective nature of what I was doing. I wasn't actually improving my physique at a certain point. It's actually hurting my own physique. So we got to pay attention to what's the motivation and what's the objective nature of the choices I'm making, and what are they going to lead to? And then the synchronicities are just unfolding to bring that about.
Okay. Now, with synchronicities, I've also read that these can happen to groups of people. Do you think that, again, with this notion of entanglement, in a case like that, do you think we might all be entangled, or do you think that this might go more towards the mathematical, the patterns within patterns, right? Like we make choices or events unfold. Actually, I want to call it the butterfly effect, right? Maybe that's a good way to look at some of this. But on an individual level, or with, two people, you might be able to say something different potentially could be happening than with a large group of people, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that it's a great question, and it deserves some thought. What comes to mind is an experience I had last year when I went to Burning Man. It was my second time at Burning Man after 15 years, which is pretty wonderful experience. And I've been dealing with some health issues around my being able to play well, and my hands are a little bit more less controlled and more shaky than they used to be. And so I was at an open mic with my guitar at Burning Man and playing, and I was, as usual, this is a synchronicity. This is like a nightmare that I have recurring, and it happens in my waking life too. I get up there and I go to tune my guitar, and they don't have a tuner and they don't have a guitar, so I have to bring mine. And I've been in the desert all day, so I'm trying to tune it, and they're not giving me time to do that. And so I'm tuning it while I'm talking to the audience, and then I start to play, and I'm, barely in tune. It's like this whole recurring experience, and I've played for long enough that I know how to do that, but it's not very fun. So I'm up there playing the song. To me, it's like sounding mediocre. My voice is sort of shaky. I'm not that confident. And afterwards, this woman, I sit down and I'm like, whatever, I'm going to do it. Like, this isn't about me. I'm just going to be here and do what I do. I'm not going to judge myself. And that shift was important for me inside. And I had a good time, and I sat down, and someone came up and passed me a note. I still have the note in my desk. It says, "Thank you for sharing your music. I really needed to hear that today. It really changed my life." So
that's
there's this connection in the crowd about like what song happened at what moment, and how did it move this person, or how did it move the group in a certain way. And I'm just reminded that I can't take for granted what I think is going on with everybody else. And that comes back to flow. If I can stay in the flow of just choosing the songs I want to play, or saying the things I want to say, or being the person I want to be, naturally that's going to align with something that somebody else is going to benefit from, if it's coming from a place of real, authentic, expression.
Well, and so I'm just scrolling down here. I knew this was in my questions. You wrote a book, Living in the Flow, The Science of Synchronicity and How Choices Shape Your World. And I should have had this memorized. I was like, why is that so familiar? So published in 2019, which just makes me completely ignorant. So that was the first one. In 2021, you published The Leap to Wholeness, How the World is Programmed to Help Us Grow, Heal, and Adapt. So again, the first book is about the flow and making these choices, bringing, I guess, putting yourself out there so that these synchronicities can happen and help guide your life, right? What is your new book about, The Leap to Wholeness?
Well, the first book does that, and it also gives a model, like the model that I've been working on for about 15 years, to understand how synchronicities can weave together to give us meaningful experiences. And I published some papers on that. One in particular, I published in 2020, January 1st or December 31st of 2020, actually, the 1st of 2021. And it was just a magical day, moment for that to come out. It came out 2 months before my book, Leap to Wholeness. And that work together shows that there's a science of wholeness, which is not really well evaluated. It's well established. It's part of our everyday technology through the use of Fourier analysis. But what I do is I show that space-time itself and quantum mechanics is derivable from the same principles. So you've got this notion of holism, shows up in holograms and in music, digital music. Everyday filtering, like on Instagram, uses the same technology. But wholeness is kind of like the complementarity we talked about earlier. It's not like reductionism is wrong. It's that wholeness and reductionism are different ways of looking at the same world. You can't do both at the same time. Each of them has a benefit or a certain lens, and the other has a different benefit and a different lens. So we have to accept both ways at different times to serve us.
Which, in a sense, that takes us back to quantum mechanics, right? It's the wave-particle duality. So beyond simply the books, at the Synchronicity Institute, you offer workshops, study programs, and much more. And again, the goal is helping people understand synchronicity and harness it in their own lives, right? Can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing over at the Institute?
Yeah, so the workshops we do and the training is about helping people. We're all going to experience challenges and problems and obstacles. What we can do is not create further problems and obstacles when we encounter them, right? So when we're in flow, it's not like we don't have problems, but we're able to adapt and respond to them in ways that are like getting our filters and preconceptions out of the way. So when somebody like criticizes us for something, we don't respond with a defense of ourselves, but we find the right thing to say to neutralize or to address the concern and sort of sidestep the arrow coming at us. So I help people notice their own filters, identify what they're saying to themselves when they hear stuff, and how they're looking at the world through a certain frame. And then once I see those filters and those frames, and I've seen this with other people really quickly, you can really quickly shift your behavior because it just doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah.
Like if you know that you're doing this thing so that you can be better understood, but you also start to see like, I don't need to be understood to be appreciated, then you stop trying really hard to be understood and you start focusing on just the appreciation that you're getting.
That makes sense.
And it can really quickly shift your experience, whether, with the professionals or with your family, because you understand what's going on inside of you. So you respond differently to the synchronistic situations that show up to trigger you.
Well, Sky, on that note, let me thank you so much for your time today. It's absolutely wonderful having you on. Let me close by asking what steps you would recommend to the audience to learn more about synchronicity. What should they be reading, studying, or taking action on in their lives? And of course, I want to recommend that they read your books, right? So Living in the Flow, The Science of Synchronicity, and How Your Choices Shape Your World. I'm going to put that out there, and I will put links in the show notes to these. The other one is Leap to Wholeness, How the World is Programmed to Help Us Grow, Heal, and Adapt. Again, I will put links in there. Are there other resources that people should be taking advantage of to learn more about synchronicity?
You did mention my workshops too, which is a live opportunity to learn. There's so much great material out there. Some of the people I follow are like Brene Brown, who does work on understanding your own motivations and your own feelings. And I think we could benefit from all becoming more emotionally literate, not because we need to somehow become more emotional, expressive, but because by understanding our reactions in the world, how we respond to people and situations, that's what drives everything, right? That's what drives policy making. That's what drives the direction we make with our families and our relationships, how we decide to direct our businesses. it's all related to our internal alignment with what's true for us or not. And so people like Brené Brown do great work. And I've done a lot of reading of some of the deep spiritual texts. I've also read a lot of the early physics texts. One of my favorite books is The Dancing Wu-Li Masters by Gary Zukav.
Okay.
Great description of the sort of east-west connection between quantum mechanics. So those are some recommendations.
Wonderful, wonderful. Sky, on that note, let me thank you once again for your time today, sir.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's been great to talk with you.